On June 27, protesters took to the streets again in cities across Kenya. On Thursday, many calling for President William Ruto to resign, even after he bowed to their demands to withdraw a tax hike bill. What was the tax proposal all about? What economic problems they were meant to fix? What is the government planning to do next? And what the people of Kenya are saying?
This week, Kenya is revolting, and we're calling upon all people of goodwill, lovers of freedom and justice, to stand with the people of Kenya. Kenyans in the diaspora, stand with our brothers and sisters on the ground who are putting their bodies on the line to rail against this government that has decided to gamble with our futures, that has decided that it is more important to please the IMF and World Bank than to put food on the tables of Kenyan people. This revolution is being led by Kenya's youth. It's not only about rejecting the finance bill, it is also about accountability, calling for accountability for the gross misappropriation of public funds, going back several decades, going back several presidents. It is about the loss of manufacturing and processing industries in this beautiful country, loss of so many jobs. It is also about a government that is refusing to move with the times, a government that is stifling the creative pursuits, the creative industry of its young people. This is a time for radical change, and we call upon everyone. Kenyans in the diaspora, do not put your heads in the sand. Tunafanya kazi usiku na mchana to make something for ourselves, to take it back home, to buy land. Now, with this current trajectory, there will be no land to buy. There will be no home to go back to Amkeni. This revolution needs all of us.
A finance bill is usually presented to Parliament before the start of a finance year that runs from July to June, laying out the government fiscal plans. In the 2024-2025 bill, the Kenyan government wanted to raise $2.7 billion in additional taxes to reduce the budget deficit and borrowing. Kenya's public debt stands at 68% of GDP, higher than the 55% of GDP recommended by the World Bank and the IMF. President Ruto has been caught between the competing demand of lenders such as the IMF, which is urging the government to cut deficit to obtain more funding, and a hard-pressed population. On Wednesday, they withdrew the bill, bowing to pressure from the protesters who had argued the measures would choke the economy and raise the cost of living for people already struggling to make ends meet. How would this proposed recommendation by IMF and World Bank affect the population of Kenya?
The International Monetary Fund, IMF, faces accusations of imposing difficult conditions on developing countries, most of them in Africa, in exchange for loans. Those conditions are said to have far-reaching consequences on the borrower countries, including interference with internal governance, sinking nations deeper into debt, and creating a larger pool of poor people. Kenneth Rogoff, an American professor who worked as IMF's chief economist, says the lender gives loans to countries with exploding debt to GDP ratios. Simply put, the IMF extends loans to countries already struggling with existing debts. Rogoff gave the example of Ghana, which was already in debt distress in 2021, but the IMF gave it a loan of $1 billion for post-COVID-19 recovery. The IMF, in its assessment report of Ghana in July 2021, said, while noting that risks to Ghana's capacity to repay have increased, IMF's executive directors concurred that they are still manageable. In May 2023, the IMF added Ghana a $3 billion loan despite describing the country's debt as unsustainable. The funding was extended after Ghana defaulted on $30 billion loans in December 2022. But even as the IMF faces accusations of sinking debt-distressed countries, questions about its tough loan conditions continue to be posed. In June 2023, Tunisia's President Kais Saied rejected IMF's conditions for a $2 billion bailout. The IMF had asked Tunisia to restructure over 100 state-owned companies and remove subsidies on food and fuel. In June 2023, the president said IMF's conditions were like putting a matchstick on explosives. In Kenya, the IMF had in July 2022 asked the East African nation to remove maize and fuel subsidies introduced by the then President Uhuru Kenyatta. Upon assuming office in September 2022, President William Ruto removed the subsidies, saying they were an economic burden. In December that year, IMF approved Kenya's $450 million loan request. IMF says fossil fuel subsidies is the main reason for high carbon emissions and revenue shortage. In its May 2019 report, the lender said if there were no fuel subsidies, global carbon emissions would have been 28% lower and tax revenues higher by 3.8% globally. The IMF says its preconditions, including calls for more taxes, are aimed at removing structural problems that may hamper economic stability. On average, there are about 25 conditions before an IMF loan gets approved. A study done by researchers from the universities of Cambridge and Oxford showed that between 1995 and 2014, the conditions IMF had imposed on 16 West African countries caused governments there to reduce healthcare budgets. The IMF extends two types of loans: a lending arrangement and an outright loan. A lending arrangement requires the borrower to meet conditions before getting a loan, while an outright loan does not have any preconditions. In the early 1980s, many African leaders took IMF and World Bank loans. Conditions including cuts on social spending were set. A World Bank report subsequently showed the number of people living below $1 a day in sub-Saharan Africa doubled from 164 million to 316 million between 1981 and 2001. The IMF and the World Bank are controlled by $1 one vote, and most of the voting shares are held by wealthy nations. The US alone holds enough shares in the IMF to give it veto power.
So, what were the proposed tax measures? The proposed tax measures that trigger a week of protests and some violent confrontations included new levies on basic commodities such as bread, vegetable oil, and sugar, and a new motor vehicle circulation tax to peg at 2.5% of the value of a car to be paid annually. An eco levy on most manufactured goods had also been on the cards, though sanitary towels and diapers had been exempted in earlier adjustment, among other last-minute concession before the whole bill was pulled. The bill had proposed increasing existing tax on financial transactions. The government said the tax measures were necessary to fund development programs and cut public debts. President William Ruto said on Wednesday he will not sign the finance bill into law. He will return to the parliament with the recommendation that all its clauses be deleted. Ruto wrote in a document addressed to the Speaker of the National Assembly. To help tackle the fiscal deficit, Ruto said the government will now work on austerity measures, beginning with cuts to the presidency-owned budget and focus on operational expenditure, including travel, vehicle purchases, and renovations. There is obviously scope for austerity because the argument was that the taxes were being asked for, but the view from the public was that there was wastage and unnecessary spending, said Eric Masou, Executive Director for Research and Sustainable Finance at the Standard Investment Bank. The issue is which areas are going to be affected. Muswa said the government could also borrow more than it initially planned. Obviously, if they keep borrowing, that is going to be a big challenge. So, austerity becomes an important element. and for them to really push on quite quickly, he said. S&P Global Ratings said on Thursday that Kenya was unlikely to achieve its fiscal target after the planned tax hike were withdrawn. The finance minister said last week, before the bill was withdrawn, that concession on tax hike would blow a 200 billion Kenyan shilling, that is $1.55 billion, hole in the 2024-2025 budget and necessitate spending cuts. President William Ruto has pledged to start a dialogue with Kenyan's youth, but he has yet to provide more details. Despite the scrapping of the bill, some protesters on Thursday called for Ruto's resignation. Messages on social media, however, suggested people were divided on how far to go with the demonstration. However, there is no recognized figurehead leading the protest, and crowds have responded to banners, slogans, and calls on X and other outlets. The administration of President William Ruto needs to move quickly and develop a roadmap that addresses the issue that the young people of Kenya are facing, and concerns that were raised, such as corruption and unemployment. Africa, wake up. Africa, rise up. Africa without borders. Africa, continental free trade area. The time is now. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.